Why should you play Harry? I don't know either, man. So I got someone else to do this deck profile. So for reals now, why play Harri? So Harri creates a field for free. You like free fields. This is one of those decks where you basically invest very little to get a lot, right? As long as you got the right soul, you can get pretty much a free field. You like force markers, but you also like Excel too. And you can't really choose which one you like more. So instead of getting a lot of extra circles, Harri gets one fat circle that, again, kind of gets fat. You still get your draw from Excel too. But at least you have this one fat circle that can hit over things, and usually you can kind of bounce things there and recall something there to make more attacks on this one fat field. So if you like that playstyle, then it's for you. And you can also go Excel 1. It's not like you always have to go Excel 2. Going Excel 1 means you can kind of go for a quicker attack, but it's like a quick timing attack if you know your opponent is weak and early on, and the game won't last too long. So yeah, there's that choice. You like scaling fields that put on pressure every turn. Harri is not necessarily always going to be like this fast, crazy attack deck. It's scale. So after a few turns of grade 3, you're going to be putting on a lot of pressure, and that's when your opponent just can't guard and you win. And you also like paying more money for your cards. For some reason, Pale Moon is always just, you have to pay a bit more money for your cards just because it's Pale Moon. So if you like just parting with your wallet, then go for it. This is the deck for you. So let's jump with Derick. Derick's pretty much gonna guide you through the rest of this video with all the plays in his deck profile. So let's jump to him, alright?
Hey, it's Derick from WCC. Just gonna go through a deck profile on Harri and essentially my choices and the flexibilities that you have in this deck. This deck is pretty good, so just gonna go right into it. So the first cards we have are for Harri. Pretty self-explanatory, the engine of the deck, nothing too much to explain there. When he rides, he gets an XL2, and then you choose one of your additional rearguard circles and it becomes a stage for the rest of the game. And what the stage means, it essentially just means every XL circle that you get from then on stacks on top of each other. And then essentially the next few slots are the flex slots where you can decide to run different options. I know that there are some builds that run quite obscure cards, but in this particular deck, I chose to run 2 Alice and 1 Dorian. So the reason why I play Alice in comparison to decks that run Gun Salute is that you're able to have a really strong offensive turn by calling out this grade 4 dragon. So the whole notion of the deck allows you to multi-attack, I think up to 1, 2, 3, 4, about 5 times on average on a turn. Alice allows you to push it to 6 and potentially 7 depending on how much counterblast your opponent gives, and that could be threatening. If you have a turn where you have double dragon, essentially your opponent has to guard 40,000 with guard restrict and a crit in the same turn, which makes it so that they don't get the time to be able to reproduce hand and guard efficiently with against the dragon. So to be able to use Alice in this deck as opposed to something like Gun Salute, I focus more on having Harri as the base engine, whereas Gun Salute is more of a Vanguard oriented alternate win con. I like the fact that Harri produces 5,000 power to the units that he calls out. This makes it so that, for example, if your opponent sits at 4 damage, then at least your rear guards can still hit, even if your opponent gets a defensive trigger. So having Alice on a rear guard behind a booster that you call out from Harri, that's already a 12 plus 13, which is a 25. The only deck that really matters in this case would be Majesty Lord Blaster, so MLB, because it sits on 18k, and if they get a defensive trigger, then pretty unlucky you're sitting on a 28k base. But other than that, like every other deck, Shaharat, Vanquisher and stuff like that, they're all like 12ks and they don't have any additional base power. So having that extra booster that gains the 5k behind an Alice just makes it so that you're always going to be able to hit while they are at 4 damage. And then the last card that I put in is Dorian, and she has a few purposes in this deck. So one of the main ones is to be able to recycle all your Magia dolls back into Soul. There are times where you're pretty unlucky and you don't get the Magia dolls that you want throughout the previous turns. So you're very restricted on how many numbers or how many copies of a Magia doll you have available to you on subsequent turns, essentially. So Dorian allows you to suck up everything into Soul, draw a bunch of cards, and then pretty much sets you up so that you have 3 to 4 Magia dolls to be able to call out with Harri on the next turn. And then 2 Dragon, pretty self-explanatory. The engine of the deck, the reason why the deck is good, get you 3 XL circles to stack on the stage, has 40k crit, well, potentially more, and guard restrict, pretty much your win con. The reason why I run 2 dragons as opposed to some decks that run 3, I just find that 3 is a little bit overkill just because that 3rd dragon can be swapped into maybe a grade 2 Magia doll. I do know that I do run quite obscure grade 2 and grade 1 Magia doll lines, and you know, having that extra slot to be able to slot in maybe a grade 2 or grade 1 is really crucial. And you know, swapping out one of the dragons for like an Alice or a Dorian allows you to have an additional play in your deck. So going on from this, we're going to talk about the grade 2s. So the MVP, or the little pigeon that calls out the dragon, so Law Pigeon Pop. I run Pop at 4. You just want to see it every single game. It's literally your engine. If you don't see it, then yeah, scoop, shake hands, go to the next round. I run 3 Jacqueline, 2 Lunatic Dragon, and 3 Prana. So there are some decks that I found don't run Jacqueline, and I don't know, I just feel like those decks are pretty high rolly. Jacqueline gives you the option to be able to search for your pop. And the main purpose of Jacqueline is essentially serving as a 5th, a 6th, and a 7th copy of Law Pigeon Pop. So to be able to just counterblast 1, search your deck for 2 cards, add it to hand, and then just cycle any card into Soul is amazing. The best thing about this card is that she puts a card from your hand into Soul. So this really works well with Alice. So if you counterblast 1, top 7 check for 2 Magia dolls, you're able to put in a pigeon or a dragon into Soul, which sets up Alice for your late game turns. So that means that late game, or even like mid game even, so you attack with Alice, you have that pigeon in Soul, and you also have that dragon in Soul, or you know, one or the other, right? So Alice can call out the pigeon can call the dragon, and you can essentially set up a double dragon turn. Or ultimately, you can go Alice straight into a dragon, which also performs as a 2 dragon turn, which makes it really, really hard for your opponent to guard. And also, Jacqueline having the option to be able to put any Magia doll into Soul is so strong in the early game. This deck really prioritizes on certain Magia dolls being in Soul on the initial grade 3 ride. And for you to be able to tutor in the top 7 for up to 2 Magia dolls is insane. So you can selectively pick Magia dolls depending on the situation of the game, and then essentially just put it into Soul to be able to set up for the grade 3 Harri turn. I put Prana at 3, Lunatic at 2, just because of the slots. You can reduce Alice if you are playing a pure Harri build, but in this particular build, I run Alice and Dorian. So those slots can actually be bumped into Prana and Lunatic if you feel like it. But I just feel that Lunatic in this day and age, there's so many decks that, you know, clean up the field or play like a shadow field. For example, Vanquisher, you have your Jaggy shots, and Aquaforce has their grade 1, and Coral Salt. There's just so many decks that, you know, just suck up stuff and leave you with an empty field. So Lunatic Dragon isn't as good, but there are some decks where Lunatic Dragon really shines, and yeah, having that at 2 I think is suitable. And Prana, she makes it so that your Vanguard doesn't hit like a wet noodle. So you call Prana out off your grade 3 Harri turn, giving her a 10k buff, as well as your Vanguard a 10k buff. When you go first, that 10k buff is huge. So to be able to have that 10k buff initially on your grade 3 turn is ridiculous. So moving on to your grade 1s. My grade 1s are quite weird, so just be mindful. You can sort these however you like. So my grade 1 lineup, sorry. 3 Periton, 3 of the Mirror Master, 3 Masquerade Bunny, and 3 Betty. Now, Masquerade Bunny, actually we'll start from the left. So your Flying Periton, one of the best Magia dolls in the deck, just draws you a card, and on top of that, Mirror Master equally as good to be able to countercharge. These two Magia dolls are pretty much tied as the most important Magia dolls in the deck. So you always want to prioritize these two over Prana and Lunatic to be in Soul on your grade 3 ride, as well as you always want to look at a way to be able to put these two into Soul for subsequent Harri turns. To be able to countercharge and refund Harri's cost is so important in this deck because Alice uses additional counterblasts to pretty much aggro out your opponent. Masquerade Bunny, just a card to be able to search for your Harri. You don't want to be riding an Alice, it just feels bad moment. And also, Masquerade Bunny, you can search top 5 for any grade 3, and then you can dump your dragons, or you can dump Magia dolls to be able to cycle through with your pigeon. And then Betty, not a lot of people actually run this card. So Betty, I think primarily her best skill is actually her on Vanguard ride skill, which is essentially a draw and then put one card from your hand into Soul. The most important part about that skill is the fact that you get to put one card from your hand into Soul, which means that you can set up for your Alice late game, or alternatively, you can actually set up for your grade 3 Harri turn. So you can put your Flying Periton in Soul, your Mirror Masters in Soul, and you just know how to prioritize essentially what Magia dolls you want in your Soul. So the last is, your grade 0s. Startup, pretty self-explanatory. And this deck, I run 8 crits, 4 draws, 4 heals. Fronts are kind of useless just because you want to amp the crit and hit your opponent in blocks of 2. I do know that there are some decks that do run, 10 crit, 2 draw, and just a few mixtures and such, but I find that running any less than 4 draws, you're never going to be able to find your Magia dolls, and hitting a draw on your damage check is just so satisfying. And there are decks now that run 8 draw to play aggressively. This deck doesn't really need that, so playing 4 draws is perfect.
So that Derick's explained his deck. Let's kind of go through some strengths and weaknesses of Harri. So strengths, you can hit over your opponent's triggers. Basically, if you place your cards right, everything kind of hit over at least one trigger. You can basically do a bit of everything. You draw, you countercharge, you remove your opponent's field with Lunatic Dragon. And you have crit pressure as well, so you can damage deny. And that pressure increases every turn because you generate more Excel circles. It means that one stage gets fatter and fatter, and that means your pigeon becomes fatter, and then your Starry Pop Dragon becomes fatter. And overall, low resource requirements. When you think of it, if you use Harri's effect, you're only using 1 CB, you're only ditching 1. And those are basically refunded when you call out your Periton, when you call out your Mirror Master, and then the only CB that you're actually using is your Pigeon. So overall, low resource requirements. And even when you're going for your finisher of Alice, that is still just like an extra CB, so you can kind of plan out how you want to do it. The weaknesses of this deck is that it's extremely piece reliant. If you don't get the right cards into Soul, or you don't get like the perfect 4, right? You only get like 2, then your turn is really, really limited. You also rely heavily on riding Harri, so you really need... It's like a 1 grade 3 deck, right? I mean, you could say, Night Rose is a 1 grade 3 deck, but they also mill. They also have different ways to salvage that grade 3. So the only way you're doing it is just via grade 3 search, or by naturally drawing or G-assisting. And if you compare that, if you also like pop that with your needing of different Magidolls into your Soul, then it can kind of become more like piece reliant than you actually want. For an Excel deck as well, it's limited in space. You don't generate extra circles. So you're always stuck on a certain amount of attacks that can be easily planned out. At the same time, that column, like that circle, is actually very big. But you also have to decide, lastly, on consistency and more finishing power. So if you look at this deck, especially if you look at the deck that Derick just showed you, he runs some extra cards like Alice, which is not a Marge at all, but that increases his finishing power. But that lowers the consistency because you have to lower the amount of Marginals you can play. While if you just went pure Marginals, you don't really have a finisher except for overall scaling of Starry Pop Dragon. So you have to choose between that, and if you go a more extra finishing power route, then you will have slightly less consistency. But enough of that, let's jump with Derick, back to Derick again, and he can show you some of the combos that you can do with this deck and some of the mulligans.
Alrighty, just going to go through your bread and butter combos and just some other combos in the deck. So optimally, you want 4 of these, so 1 of each name in Soul if your opponent is on grade 3. But initially, right, you have to determine what your opponent gives you and prioritize which units are essentially worth keeping in Soul and which ones you need to call out, right? So I prioritize Mirror Master as the #1 priority card, just because if your opponent only gives you 1 Counterblast to work with on your grade 3 turn, then at least you can use your Counterblast to Counterblast 1 and then call out the Mirror Master and then countercharge again, which opens up your Pigeon. So she is #1 priority, and then second one would be Periton, to just be able to draw you cards, farm advantage, to go through your opponent's grade 3 turn. Generally, in this day and age, your opponent's grade 3 turn after your initial grade 3 turn is a lot stronger, so to be able to just farm advantage is really good. And then Prana coming in third. Like I said previously, you don't want your Vanguard to just hit 12k, so having her on rearguard, she's a 24 because she gains 5k off Harry's skill. So she's a 24, and then your Vanguard is a 22, which is pretty game changing. So generally how you want to call them out, right? Depending on how much resource your opponent gives you. So you would want to call Mirror Master to one of the side rearguards and Prana, and then you leave your Pigeon in your stage, essentially. But you don't necessarily have to keep it that way. Let's just assume that the opponent is going second, so you're going first, right? You want to set it up in this particular way, just because this hits for 13, this hits for 22, and this hits for 24. This means that whatever your opponent checks on damage check, at least you can still hit over it. Alternatively, you can actually put this behind the Vanguard, or even like behind Prana, just because your Pigeon would hit 14, right? So let's just ignore these Excel circles. So you have 1 Excel, and then you have 1 Pigeon. So your Pigeon initially will hit 14, which then calls a dragon, and then the dragon will be 10,000, right? So the placement of units is quite important, but generally it's something along the lines of this. So you have your Pigeon on your stage, you have a 13k hitter, you have your 22 Vanguard, and then your 24 rearguard. So that's your grade 3 ride combo, but generally if you're going second, it'd be something like this. So you'd have your 2 grade 2s in the front, your 2 grade 1s at the back, and then you have a Pigeon there. This hits for like 37, this is 27, your center column hits 22, and then your Pigeon hits 9 plus 5 times however many Excel circles you have. So it's pretty easy. Usually you swing with Pigeon first. Pigeon is usually the smallest number, so in this case it's 14, and then you use its skill, return it back to hand, then you call the dragon. Now the dragon, you always want to filter out every copy of this card. So if 1 copy is already out, so the other one, unless you had G-assisted with it, or it's in your hand, or it's in your damage, or it's in your soul, it's always going to be in your deck, right? So you always want to find the dragon in your deck, get it out, and then you get your Excel, and then draw 1. So this will sit your dragon at 10 plus 20, so it's a 30k. Now, the best thing about that number is that if you hit a damage trigger, a drive check trigger, then you put it all on the dragon, and your dragon initially will be 40,000, which activates his crit and his sentinel block. So if you look at the numbers now, you're hitting still 22, 27, 37, and then you're hitting 30 at the moment, which means that regardless if your opponent gets a damage trigger, each of these can still hit, right, after your pigeon attacks. So generally you attack with your Vanguard next, and then put all the triggers there. So for example, you do your drive checks, heal, put 10,000, and then Harri, cool, that's another ride for the next turn, stacking more Excel circles. So now your dragon's 40. So these two here, you want to push first. So 27, 37, and then your dragon, 40,000, straight up on grade 3 ride. And that's like pretty much your bread and butter combo. So the next play we're going to talk about is the double dragon combo, utilizing Alice. So you have, your Alice in Soul, and then you also have a pigeon to be able to call out the initial dragon. And then obviously at this point in the game, then you're pretty stacked on Excel Circle. Let's just say you rerode an extra time or something, and you're like sitting on 3, right? So optimally you want to use Harri's skill, and the the 2 dragon play depends on how you want to construct this combo. So you either go Harri into pigeon into dragon, or you go Alice straight into a dragon, right? Sorry, I said Harri before, but it's actually Alice. So there's 2 ways you can do it. If you go into the pigeon, then you need to use an extra counterblast, but generally if you have dragon and soul, you might as well just go straight into dragon anyways. So initially you want to use your Harri skills, so you counterblast 1, discard a card, and then you call out your 4 Magia Dolls. Now this is important depending on the placing of these cards, right? So you need to free a slot for Alice so that she can combo into the pigeon or into the dragon to be able to aggro out your opponent. So generally Prana goes in the front row. Obviously these 2 go in the back row somewhere. So you can put it there, or generally it's like behind here. And then your dragon has to go in the empty slot that isn't in the front row. This is so that you free a slot up for Alice, and then obviously your pigeon goes into the Excel circle. Okay, so that's optimally your play. So I'm just going to move this down because you don't actually see my little bird. All right, so that's essentially the placement of this particular turn. And then from here, you swing the pigeon returns back to hand. Oh, sorry, you counter charge 1 with Mirror Master, and then you just draw and do all the other effects, but I'm not going to go through that. So you bounce the pigeon by counterblasting 1, and then you call the dragon. You always want to call the dragon that isn't in your soul, so that you still have the availability to play into the Alice combo. So you call this, get your Excel circle, draw you a card, whatever. And then now, do you attack with the dragon first? No. So the reason why you don't attack with the dragon first is that at the moment, you just want to pump all the power there, or alternatively you can split the power but then you pressure with crit after your Vanguard attack, and at this stage your opponent should be about 3 damage, 4 damage, and having an extra crit on that dragon hits for 3 damage, which is quite crucial. So you attack with your Vanguard, you drive check, it's like a standard can't crit trigger. Cool. So then your dragon, now it's like 4 Excel circles, so it hits 20 plus 20. So see the importance of having each of the Magia Dolls on the field. So even though this is behind, this still hits 24, so it still hits over a damage trigger. So that is really, really important, and I can't like make that any more clear. You need to have each of these Magia dolls on the field. So now your dragon hits 40, it dies, and then now you technically would attack with like Prana first, so you go that, and then you know your dragon, and then your dragon dies, and then here is when you go into Alice. So in this case, I still have 2 open counterblast. Now depending on how I want to play next turn, you know, I can still take damage and stuff, so it's all good. So in this case, I can afford to go into the pigeon, and then the pigeon goes into the dragon. So after attack, counterblast 1. You know, Soul Blasting 1, and then this calls the pigeon. Like I said before, the pigeon can be put in using Jacqueline, using Betty, and you can also use Dorian to be able to put the pigeon into Soul. So having access to cards that put non-Magia dolls into Soul is quite important for this particular combo. So then next you attack with the pigeon. Pigeon, counterblast 1, return back to hand, calls another dragon, gets another Excel, draw a card, and there. So now the dragon is base 25 plus 20, and you're hitting for another 45k crit with guard restrict. And yeah, your opponent at this point in the game has to throw out so much of their resource and their advantage to guard 2 dragon attacks, which is why it's so lethal. So let's just backtrack a little bit. So let's just say, you know, you only have 1 face-up damage. So in this case, right, I'd call the dragon instead, straight up on the dragon. Don't worry about, you know, going into your pigeon and then into the dragon. So this would attack, counterblast 1, you know, Soul Blast 1, and then you call your dragon straight from Soul. Because the dragon is a grade 4, it's not a grade 3, which bypasses Alice's effect. Oh, sorry, the Alice actually has to go in Soul. So it bypasses Alice's grade 3 restriction. So this makes it so that you can call the dragon, and generally, if you have dragon in the early game, you want to put it into Soul to be able to fuel for this combo. Alrighty, just some example mulligans. Obviously you can't mulligan your starter, but essentially the top row is your priority list. So you always want a Harri in your starting hand, a pigeon in your starting hand, and then one of the Mirror Master or the Periton. You alternatively can look at Betty. Betty allows you to, you know, cycle your hand. So she's a nice card to have, but I mean, if you don't have her, then whatever. It doesn't really matter too much. It doesn't impact your, you know, your early rides and stuff like that. So I guess the next thing would be always have an additional grade 2 on top of your pigeon. So you can kind of like put it like that. So, you know, pigeon is the god of the deck. You always want to have the pigeon, and then obviously one of these 3, just so that you can ride it and always keep pigeon in hand, because the pigeon on the grade 3 is so crucial. You can actually move something like this. So the priority list goes the pigeon, you must have that in hand, and then you want to have one of the Magia dolls so that when you ride it, it's automatically going to be in Soul for your grade 3 ride. So those 2 prioritize over Jacqueline, and then, you know, Jacqueline is there. If your opponent swings under or damage denies you, this card isn't as great. But if your opponent gives you 1 CB, then at least you can search the rest of the Magia dolls and the pigeon from your deck. So you always want to have a pigeon, one of these, to be able to ride and keep the pigeon in hand. And then if you get that, then that's pretty good. And then obviously, star of the deck, you always want Harri. Just mull any additional copies in the early game, because you're going to eventually draw into them. And then, you know, these 2 are actually not really important, so they can actually go down here. Usually you mull these because later on you're just going to draw into them, and always mull the dragon. Like these 3 you should never keep in your hand, so just chuck them away. And then, you know, you have these 3. These 3 are pretty good. Any other grade 3 like Masquerade Bunny, yeah, she's pretty good. You may want her in your starting hand if you don't have Harri, so keeping her is pretty good. So she could technically go up here if you don't have the Harri yet. So those 3 prioritizes over Betty, but you know, if you get Betty, she's essentially a draw 2 filter 1. Sorry, draw 2 ditch 1, and just allows you to filter the extra card on top of your starter as well. So I guess we're just gonna do a few mulligan shuffles and stuff like that, just to see essentially what cards you should be putting back and stuff like that. This deck is pretty fun. You should definitely give this deck a go. Unfortunately, I think the next set, once Luard hits, this deck actually gets thrown in the bin. But other than that, like, this deck at the moment is secretly pretty strong. Alright, this is pretty garbage. We don't really have much other than Masquerade Bunny, so we don't have Harri, we don't have a Pigeon, we don't have another grade 2, so throw these 4 away. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, that's pretty good. I guess it follows on, you know, to the next, oops, my camera. Alright, so I guess it follows on to the next, you know, couple of draws. So, you know, you draw for turn. So here, you want to always ride Betty. You have 2 copies, like whatever, right? If you ride Betty, then at least you can put the Periton into Soul, instead of, you know, just riding it and then just missing out on the filter 1. So you'd want to ride, draw with the starter first. Alright, that's pretty good. You get your grade 2, so that means that you can keep your Pigeon in your hand. So now Betty draws 1. Oh, that's pretty good. So you got your Harri, and then you put 1 into Soul. Generally, it's like Magia Dolls or additional Pigeons, but we don't have multiple Pigeons, so you just put the Periton into Soul. And then that will set you up for your grade 3 ride. And then as you go, you know, you take 1 damage. Oh, draw trigger is pretty good. Cool, and then start of turn. Hand's pretty good. Jacqueline. Now you need to be very careful when you use that 1 damage. Your opponent can just swing under 9k if they have like an 8k or something. Then you're pretty restricted on your grade 3 turn. But other than that, just feel free to use Jacqueline. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Alright, cool. So you've got 2 Magia Dolls, you add those to hand. And then you put 1 of these into Soul. Put the Prana into Soul. In the early game, you want to push. So if you're going first, usually you can just put a Prana there and slap. If your opponent swings into it, you lose this. But then on the next turn, when you ride Harri, you can just pop out the Pigeon, and then the Pigeon puts that back in for you. So yeah, that's pretty much a pretty good mulligan. We can just mulligan again just to see what we get. But yeah, the whole notion of this deck, you need to know how to prioritize which Magia Dolls you need to put in, and it's literally from the start of the game. Because if you make a mistake in the early game, it actually snowballs really hard. So you just need to make sure that you put the right cards into Soul and whatnot. Okay, this hand's pretty decent. So you have your additional grade 2, you have your Pigeon, and you have your Harri. The only thing is, I don't really care about whatever grade 1, right? So Mull for grade 1. Oh, perfect hand. So now, if I'm going first, you know, you draw, you ride, you draw. You know, your opponent gives you 1 damage. Cool. Wow, I hit another draw trigger. Crazy. And then, you know, start of turn. So here, you have all 4 of your Magia Dolls. You already have a Periton in Soul, so you don't really need to worry about that. So you need to worry about these 3. So which of these 3 is the most important going into the next turn? So you gotta think, right? So your Harri is gonna be swinging for 12k. The most important thing to ride in these 2 is Prana. Why? Because then at least your Prana hits 24 on the rear guard when Harri calls her out. When you ride grade 3, you only get to call 2. So you're gonna call this and this or that, and you know, your Mirror Master. Mirror Master can just, you know, be used to guard, and then she goes into Soul so that you have accessibility for her. But you always want to prioritize her over this dragon any day of the week, okay? And yeah, that's pretty much a pretty OP hand. You ride, slap, bang, 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 bang. Hope your opponent doesn't guard, and no guards, eat 6 damage, and you win. Cool. So yeah, let me know what you guys think about the deck. If you guys run anything different, if you guys play Gunslu or any different variety of Harri, comment down below and just let me know so I can have a few other decks to test. And yeah, like and subscribe. I'll catch you guys later. Bye.